Hello everyone, and thank you for joining us for this Purpose Drives Profit webinar. We're delighted this will be presented by Sally Pilot, Andrew Harding, Robert Eccles and Robert Hers. Before I hand over to Sally, there are a few points I would like to make. To minimise disruption, you have all been automatically muted. If you would like to ask anything, please enter details in the questions box, as we will be taking questions throughout the course of the webinar. And following this session, you will be sent a copy of the presentation slides and a recording of the webinar. Without further ado, I'll hand you over to Sally.
Thank you very much. Gosh, so nice to see everybody today and have so many of you on the line from all over the world. Really excited to be here. I am Sally Pilot. I am the Insight and Engagement Director at Black Sun, which is a stakeholder communications company, and I will be leading today's webinar, which I'm really excited about doing. I just wanted to say that this is the official launch of a piece of research that we have compiled in collaboration with the Value Reporting Foundation and the Association of International Certified Professional Accountants, the unified voice of AICPA and CIMA. How'd I do on that, Andrew? Okay.
You got it spot on.
Fantastic. Okay. It is the fourth in a series, and I actually really wanted to make that point because we've been doing this research together as a collaboration for the last 8 years. It's a piece of research that we've done biannually. And it's a survey of executives around the world. So the way that I'm going to run the webinar is I'm just going to set up a little bit about the research, and then we're going to move to our panel discussion. I'm really excited to have such an exciting panel with me today. Those experts that have been talking about these things for a very long time. The research itself really looks at the trends in how executives understand, measure, and disclose the value that companies create. And I know this is something very close to all of our panelists' hearts, so I'm looking forward to discussing that. And this year in particular really analyzes that link between purpose and profit and how to combine them to create value for all stakeholders. So what I'm going to do next is I'm going to share my screen, if this works, hopefully. Just give me 1 minute. There we go. So there we go. That's a little bit about the research. This is the panel today. You can see them. And what I'm going to do, rather than introduce them, because they've got such rich history, and actually more importantly, how they have such an interesting relationship with one another, I thought I would just hand over to each of them to do a quick intro about themselves and then really their interest in this subject. So if I start with Bob Hertz, that would be wonderful, joining us from New Jersey, I think, this morning.
Yep, beautiful, beautiful New Jersey in summer. Thanks, Sally. Well, my interest is kind of, I guess, multifold. You know, I spent a lot of years at PwC as an auditor, as head of corporate finance services, and also last number of years as kind of the senior technical partner of the firm. And then I was one of the original members of the ISB, and then for many years chairman of the FASB. And I've been involved in the IARC when it was created, and SASB when it was created, and now the combination of the two of those in the Value Reporting Foundation. So a lot of my interest has really gone back to kind of the fact that I spent a good part of my career and life trying to improve the information set that goes into the capital markets, whether that be in financial information or other types of information, including now what we call ESG or sustainability information, other information that drives value creation or destruction over time. And so, you know, that's a real passion for me. I would also say, as I've advanced in the years and in life, not only being a father, but also now a proud grandfather, you know, I've become, I think, more environmentally and socially conscious about things, the state of our planet, so a number of the social issues, and I just, as a citizen of the world, you just kind of want to leave the place better than it is now, and deal with some of these really pressing issues. And again, I think information is very important in helping drive the right outcomes.
Amazing. Thank you, Bob, and a real pleasure to have you with us, and looking forward to hearing your insights on how much this has progressed and what more we can do moving forward. So now Bob Eccles, who just made it by the skin of his teeth to join us this morning again, because you're in Boston, I believe, Bob.
I'm in Boston. I'm jealous of Bob. I'm not in New Jersey. I'm only in Boston, and Bob's the lucky one. He's in New Jersey today. I'm not. So yeah, I'm in Boston.
And do you want to tell us a little bit about you've got such a long history in this, but maybe a couple of highlights and your interest in this moving forward?
Sure, but let me begin by thanking you, Sally, for having fellow panelists that have less hair than I do. That doesn't happen very often, so it's a pleasure. I'm feeling pretty good about myself as we start this webinar, being here with my good friend Bob Hers and Andrew. So thank you very much for that. Throw a little shade at my friends here. Bob and I go way back. We've written books together and stuff. So a lot of Bob's interests are my interests. I was the founding chairman of SASB. He was gracious enough to join the board and brought a lot of leadership to it. Like Bob, I'm looking for what are those things that will create change at a system level. I think having standards for sustainability reporting, like the IFRS Foundation, International Sustainability Standards Board, will do that. Got to sort that out with the CSRD and the EU taxonomy, what's going on in the SEC. I'm interested in activist investors and activist stewardship. I was kind of involved behind the scenes with that Engine #1 campaign. So I think there's different tools that can be brought to bear. Doing a big study on private equity. I think it's a very interesting story on private equity that could actually turn out to be a force for good as they kind of grow out of their Gordon Gekko years. I'm interested in that interface like Bob is between companies and the investment community. So corporate sustainability, ESG integration, how you get metrics, what that means for the portfolio managers, kind of the fusion that's taking place between the sustainability function and the finance function in companies, between the stewardship function and the portfolio managers on the investor side. I think fiduciary duty is an important thing to get our arms around. I'm interested in corporate form, the underlying corporate form, and not just kind of company law, but, what is the corporate form of benefit corporation? Regular C corporation. And the last thing I'll say, and this is something that's being played out more in the United States than some other places, but I'm noticing and I'm concerned about sort of an ideological dimension that is being put onto ESG, particularly in this country, particularly on the right, where it's wrong. And I think it's dangerous. You might want to talk about that some.
Okay, we'll be for sure to pick up on that. Thanks, Bob. That's really helpful. And Andrew, last but certainly not least, do you mind introducing yourself?
Yeah, thank you. And thank you, Sally. And thank you to you and your colleagues at Black Sun for 8 years of partnership on this. For me, this is a great thing to participate in. I last worked with Bob Hertz some 20 years ago, which I suspect we can't even remember what the project was, but it involved us meeting in London in the immediate aftermath of 9/11, and him inviting me to New York and telling me if I was going to go to New York, that meant I had to fly on 10/11, which we were all terrified of doing at that point, and I was the only person upstairs on a British Airways 747 that day. But for me, this topic is something which has been sort of close to my heart, close to what matters for me since I was an accounting student. I've always been fascinated by how people's behavior, how corporate behavior is influenced by information, how information can be best presented, how it motivates, how it demotivates, all of those sorts of things. For us as management accountants, we've always measured much more than the money, and when it comes to ESG, this plays perfectly into our space. No matter what we do on corporate reporting, if we don't have companies behaving in the right way and boards making the right decisions, we don't get anywhere.
Yeah, Would totally agree with that. And I know from my experience working across a number of corporates on helping them communicate and disclose to the market, a lot through the reporting, but more often than not through wider communications to wider stakeholders. It is such a powerful tool, as you said, change mindsets and behaviors and really drive thinking and innovation internally. So that's why I'm really excited about it. So the way that we're going to do this is I'm going to just give a little bit of an overview and really of the research to set the scene for the panel that I've got here, which is great. And you can see from all of the speakers that they've got great passion. What I'd really like to achieve out of this webinar is for all of you guys listening, that you go away with some real practical tips to take back to your businesses on how you can accelerate progress, change behaviors, and find the right resources to help you drive that, because I know in a lot of times that's one of the challenges internally. And also I think through this conversation, this great panel will really highlight the upcoming trends that really you should be putting on your C-suite agenda. So that's what I'm hoping to achieve. So just a little bit of background on the research. The research overall really shows that we're really witnessing what I would call significant changes to what society expects of business and how business thinks about and it communicates their purpose, okay? And prior reports in the series, I told you that we started in 2014, really in the past we've argued that changing societal expectations meant that businesses have been increasingly expected to seek and achieve both profits and purpose. And now what we found with the research this year, that overwhelmingly executives believe that managing companies using corporate purpose as this idea of a strategic framework and using it as a lens for filtering things and a lens for decision making is really critical to making good decisions and creating sustainable profits over time. So I think that's really exciting that that interdependency of purpose and profit is clearer than it ever has been in the study before. So it's more and more a lot stronger, and I think that this idea of creating value for stakeholders forms the basis of sustainable profitability, and this was definitely reinforced over the last 12 to 18 months, as we all know, and continues to be reinforced with the COVID pandemic, which really demonstrates the links between protecting the well-being of key stakeholders and corporate performance and how these things are intrinsically linked. And I always talk about COVID as being a little bit of the silver lining, and I know in our work with corporates around the world that actually a lot of these things were talked about, but now they're all firmly on the agenda, and I think that's really exciting to drive some change. So just to take you through a few of the stats that I just wanted to highlight again to set the scene. So corporate purpose is really critical. Nearly all the executives surveyed, 98%, believe it's critical to have a corporate purpose. However, there remains a gap in action. So even though almost all told us that, only about half of them really felt that their organization currently had a clearly defined purpose. And as we'll see from the panel discussion, that clearly defined purpose is really fundamental to driving a lot of this change. The next point I wanted to make was really about information, and all of the panel have already spoken about information. And again, almost 100% agree that better information is needed and that understanding all dimensions of value creation is necessary to making timely, well-informed decisions. But the challenge that we're still finding is that only 11% of companies say that they're making use of broader performance metrics in strategic decisions. So not just financial metrics, but actually non-financial metrics or ESG metrics or whatever you want to call it, taking those into account in the way that they make decision making. Now that number is very low. We had about 40% that are actually currently working and developing the tools, but that 11% of companies that really feel that they're doing that has not changed over the 8 years that we've done the survey, which I find a bit disappointing. So I really want to get under the skin of that. The next thing was really about long-term thinking. So respondents across the board also reported that taking a longer-term approach to managing their businesses would improve their ability to create value. But however, again, we see this gap in action. So although 75% believe that if they took a longer term view, they would deliver better performance, only 28% work with a time horizon of more than 3 years at the moment, although more than 60% say they would like to. So there's, again, this disconnect. Okay, so a lot of disconnect, but I'm going to end on a bit of, I think, very positive news, particularly around integrated thinking and integrated reporting. And I think that what we've seen in the survey over the last 8 years is that this is really becoming the de facto norm, as it's becoming much more established and much more understood. And a large majority of the executives, as you can see from the stats, really view integration as relevant to their objectives and supportive of business success. So 3/4 believe integrated thinking drives better decision-making and sustainable actions, okay, over the short, medium, and long term. And 75% of executives think that integrated reporting better enables a company to communicate the full range of factors that materially affect its ability to create value over time. So ending on a positive note, how can we use these tools to really drive change moving forward? So that's all I wanted to do in terms of set it up. As we said at the beginning, we'll share the slide deck and we can also share the research is available. And what I want to do now is I want to move to our panel. And if you've got any questions, please put them in the question box and I'd be happy to take them throughout. But I've got a couple that I'd like to kick off with if I can. So what I would like to start is with Bob Hertz, if I may. And Bob, I wanted you to you reflected a little bit on the global trends towards value creation and this notion of purpose driving profit. But what I'd like you to reflect on a little bit is how much has that changed since when you and Bob wrote that book 20 years ago, which I thought was actually just fascinating, and some of the thinking in there, although very innovative at the time. I mean, it's just, you know, amazing to go back and read it, and it must be a bit of a frustration in some ways for you. So can you just share with us the most significant changes you've seen in terms of thinking and dialogue, and maybe a little bit about how you think the pandemic can be used to accelerate that conversation moving forward?
Yeah, thanks, Sally. Yeah, I've actually got a copy of the book here. And if I look at the description of it in the jacket here, it says it's a rallying cry for radical improvements in corporate reporting, a biting and trenchant analysis of what's wrong with the capital markets and the information system currently. And so, you know, at the time, you know, I think it was considered kind of leading edge, even though those of us who were involved in it, Bob, I, others in the team, you know, we were seeing what kind of leading companies were doing, at least internally, to get a better handle on their operations and how over time they were things, you know, non-financial things were driving performance over time. And you know, there was the beginning of, you know, what in Europe they call triple bottom line reporting that included not only the financial picture, but how the company was doing on some of the environmental and social dimensions. And the GRI, the Global Reporting Initiative, just started out then to formulate an initial set of standards. And as we talked about in the book, there was this new technology called XBRL that, you know, you could use to electronically capture and communicate all sorts of information in a structured way. And we wrote about all that and kind of, you know, envisaged a future where you would have things that now you would find in integrated reports or in standards on ESG reporting, and the broader use to communicate and consume that information using XBRL. So we fast forward to now, and as you said, and the survey shows that most people take these ideas as being kind of almost given. It's mainstream. Certainly in terms of, you know, the longer term performance and value creation. As you said, there is a gap though in how to do it in companies, and I think that's where the integrated thinking and reporting can help, because the reporting then kind of almost then forces you to think about it. But you know, I think that really the pandemic has accelerated things. It has shown the frailties and vulnerabilities of all of us, of mankind, of companies, of society to Mother Nature. I think it's put more spotlight, even more spotlight, on the climate change, which, you know, might be slower moving, but might have even more existential consequences. We don't really deal with that seriously. So, you know, right now it's all ESG all the time. It's in management and boardrooms and in seminars like this, at conferences. When I occasionally get asked to talk to students on campuses, you know, usually accounting students, and I say to the professor who invited me, I can talk about financial accounting standards, FASB, ISB, or I can talk about ESG reporting, sustainability reporting, SASB, IRC, and almost always they say to me, the students want to hear about the latter, not about the financial reporting. They want to hear about what's really of most interest to them in their life and their future.
Super, that's helpful. Now, Bob Eccles, I know you want to jump in there, and I'd like you to share your thoughts on ESG and what you were referring to earlier on, just to kick us off.
So, Sally, I got up at 4 a.m. this morning so I could do a 6 a.m. interview with a private equity firm in Malaysia. So I'm probably a little grumpy from lack of sleep. So let me kind of start there. I mean, those statistics are remarkable to me. As Bob said, the good news, glass is like maybe not quite half full. The good news is the narrative has changed. That's good news. I wrote these down: 99 and 11.
I know.
98 and 51. So let's take the 98 and 51. I've interviewed probably 100 asset owners and asset managers over the past 2 or 3 years for research projects. When you talk to the investment community, they'd say that 51 is like 5% or 10%. You know, the clarity that the investment community is getting to companies have a clear sense of purpose is like not there. You know, it's mostly like purpose washing when you talk to the investors. The 11%. Okay, so there's these companies out there, Business Roundtable, statement of the purpose of the corporation. I go, well, that's really swell. We can solve part of the clarity of purpose problem. Why don't you just have your board of directors publish a 2-page statement of purpose? I talk, oh my God, we can't do that. Fiduciary duty, we're gonna get sued. Bullshit. I'm like, okay, fine. So this is like, I don't get it. Then you go, okay, you're all about purpose. So we're gonna communicate on purpose through standards like my friend Bob Hurst is talking about. So what's happening? The SEC comes out with a consultation on climate disclosure. U.S. Chamber of Commerce is going to sue them. I hear the companies saying, oh no, we don't need standards. You can't require this stuff. That's what they said when, you know, accounting standards were developed, you know, in the 33-34 Act. Okay, so wait a minute. You want to believe it's about purpose, but you're not going to support standards from the SEC or the ISSB. That's not authentic to me. And then this, you know, kind of long-termism thing, 28% again. I think this goes back to the board. They set executive compensation. What are the time frames? What are the metrics that gets you to 11%? You're going to solve that 11% problem by having the standards that Bob talked about, just like we've got for financial accounting. And they've got to be mandated, and they've got to be regulated, and they've got to be audited. And so for me, I think we're at a very interesting point in time. The investment community was behind the corporate community. When Bob and I wrote our book, I mean, at least credit to the corporate community. They were talking about this stuff. Investment community didn't care about it at all. That flipped. I wrote about this in HBR a couple of years ago. That flipped, and now the investors are the one way ahead of the game, and they're pushing it. Companies need to catch up. So if there's companies on this call, it's time for you to get real and get authentic. Statement of purpose from your board of directors, support the ISSB or whatever is, you think is important in terms of standard setting between the EU and the SEC, ISSB, and they converge together, build that into executive compensation, have your board publish a statement of purpose. I think what needs to be done is pretty simple. I just don't see the will in the part of the corporate community to do it.
Okay, so, and that's very clear, Bob, and I'm just as frustrated as you. What is it? In my experience, it's usually we need somebody at the top to really own it and champion this for it to actually, be embraced by an organization. How can we knock down some of those barriers? Because that 11%, even with all the pressure on moving towards global standards, it's surprising that that hasn't moved at all, in my view, because there's been increasing pressure over the last 3 years. So do you have any views for those, people out there that are in corporates trying to get the voice of the board? What should they be doing?
So I think, CEOs, in generally are beginning to get it. I still think there's a certain amount of purpose watching. I think at least in the States, the roadblocks are the CFO and the general counsel. CFOs aren't comfortable with this kind of information. They don't know how to talk about this information. Admittedly, the internal control and measurement systems for gathering it up aren't as good. So, doing integrated reporting from the CFO point of view is, difficult and complicated. And then the general counsel is kind of Dr. No, right? Just do whatever you're required by regulation. Don't do more than that. Otherwise, you're going to get sued. So, I think those functions are problematic, and I think the CEO, every good integrated report I've seen has been driven by the CEO. When it's just done by the, kind of PR department bolt-on salary we talked about, it doesn't have to do with how the company is being managed from an integrated point of view. And I do think the board is important, but then it's tricky because how do you get to boards? Bob's got real experience being on boards. He should talk about it. They're dispersed, there's not like an easy place to go to. So mobilizing the board of directors and to support a CEO that wants to do these things, I think is important. And I'm, a little dubious about boards as well. I think, there's variation like in all things, but there you've got sort of a collective action problem because there's going to be 8, 9, 10, 12 board members. So, I'd love Bob's insights into kind of board dynamics and how you get boards behind this, because that's really key.
Okay, all right. So why don't we quickly go to Bob about board dynamics, and then I want to bring Andrew in because I know he's got a very good tool that they've been developing at AICPA. So Bob, quickly on board.
Yeah, clearly different companies and different boards are at different stages right now on this journey. There's some that are into it very seriously, and some that are just learning, or even some I think still have a blind spot around it. But I've participated in exercises that were, I'd say, a combination of senior management and board driven to really, you could call it define the corporate purpose or the mission of the enterprise. Really, who are we set up to serve, and what, who are we serving, and with what? And that takes a lot of introspection, actually. It's not something you do just on the fly. It really takes a lot of thinking and also surveying people in the company and getting information on how you're viewed by your investors, by your other key stakeholders, employees, and very importantly, customers and the public at large. And then once you've defined that, you then kind of have to say, okay, a few things. One, how do we implement it? We just can't just say, okay, this is our mission or this is our purpose, and then go back, and business as usual. What are we doing that is consistent with that? What are we doing that maybe not consistent with that? And then that has to be translated into just about all the activities in the company, all the internal communications, the external communications, the onboarding, and training of people, and the day-to-day decision making as well. And it takes time, and it takes kind of retraining your kind of muscle memory, so to speak. But I've been through a couple of those exercises, which have made, I think, were genuine efforts and have begun to, I think, make a real difference.
Oh, super. Okay, that's really insightful. And actually, your point on understanding and engaging with wider stakeholders is a really important one, which is a very hot topic, particularly in the UK. But one of the things that also came out from the research is one of the most significant changes we've seen over the 8 years is really the recognition of the changing importance of wider stakeholders. Investors are always going to be important, but the importance of wider stakeholders, employees, customers, the general public, supply chain, rising up that agenda. And Andrew, I want to bring you in here because I know that you've created a business recovery toolkit with a piece on reshaping your business model. And what struck me about that when I looked at it was the focus on understanding stakeholders and what that means for business. Do you want to share a little bit about that?
Yeah, of course, Sally. This, if we think about the sort of primacy of shareholder value, that probably goes back 40 years or so. It started early 1980s. Before that, businesses had other sorts of multiple objectives. And if you like, it probably reached its peak in terms of aggressive shareholder value with sort of Enron, WorldCom, all those sorts of things. After which we started to see, and you can see these timelines. Enron's 20 years ago now, but you can see all that coming along, and the two Bob's books, and the rise of triple bottom line, that sort of thing. And the integrated reporting framework very much started to codify this new world, identifying multiple stakeholders, and because they're all part of how you create value. If you go back to that point of 1980, 80% of a company's value is reflected on its balance sheet. I don't know what it is today; it's less than 15%. And so that other, that lost value, if you like, that hidden value is elsewhere. And it is around customers. Businesses have always said customer is king. So let's start looking at that. But going beyond that, as you say, it's about all the people in the business's ecosystem. The business needs to think about that because they all have an impact on how it operates. The towns in which it has its production facilities or offices, the countries in which it sells its products. It goes beyond customers. It goes beyond employees. I'll often be very simplistic if I'm talking to finance people in particular, and I'll say, would you rather, particularly to the compliance people who say, oh, let's say the minimum. I said, would you rather tell the story yourself, or would you rather someone else told it for you on social media? And then they go, okay, I see where you're coming from. But there is change afoot. My first post-lockdown lunch 6 weeks ago was with a FTSE 100 CFO. We talked about ESG. He says, I'm talking to analysts about this stuff already. They're there. A little bit like Bob Eccles was saying, the leading investors are already talking about this stuff. What we're seeing with the reporting movements at the moment is probably a democratization of that information. People are seeing it matters, and things are shifting. But that's really what the business recovery toolkit is all about. It's about recognizing how you create value and the importance of all stakeholders in that.
Super, that's helpful. And your point about telling your story, I think, is a good one, because I think what's common about the common thing that comes out from all the conversations I have, whether it's with investors, whether it's with regulators, whether it's with raters and rankers, it's to tell companies to own their story, or somebody else is going to tell it for them. So they need to tell that story. So maybe Bob Hertz, maybe in your experience as serving as a director of major companies, I did a webinar a couple of weeks ago, and one of the NEDs on the webinar said, the role of the CEO and the board is to be the chief storyteller. And I love that, because I thought that's it. You really need to get them actually telling the story and articulating the story, because through that, there's a lot of value. What do you think about that, and how important do you think that is?
Well, I think this goes back to my prior comments about, if you're really going to take this seriously, it's got to be embedded in the internal and external communications. Now, the extent to which you have the CEO and other members of senior management take the lead in that versus the board, I think there are different philosophies on that, but everybody needs to kind of have a consistent message and story, and it's got to align with the underlying reality of what the company's really doing. You got to walk the talk, which is, I think, maybe the most important thing that when we're talking about the reporting is, what we saw when companies started to say, okay, I'll put out this nice glossy corporate social responsibility report with lots of nice color photos of happy people and all of that, and that's great. But I think a lot of people saw through that it was more PR and even greenwashing than reality. Well, the world has started to move on beyond that, and in a world where we'll talk about where there's probably going to be mandatory reporting in this space. You're going to have to take it seriously. You're going to be held accountable.
Oh, super. I think we just lost him for a second. So I'm going to go
your risk management and your strategy and the company's, how the company operates.
Super. Okay, thanks. Now, Bob, I know you want to jump in there, and I thought be great to hear your views. And actually, maybe if you could share a little bit more about your experience with you mentioned your statement of purpose, but I think that's a really valuable tool. Maybe you could articulate a little bit more about that and the work you've done.
Bob cut it out a little bit. I'd just like to tell him that I'm sympathetic to the fragile electrical grid in New Jersey, Bob. We don't have those problems here in Boston. So I just want to let you know you've got my sympathies, for that infrastructure problem that you're suffering with. So I think the storytelling thing is interesting, right? I mean, that's where you start, the board of directors statement of purpose, right? And I think what Bob was saying is that this is hard work, reflecting on this, you've got to be introspective. But it's basically intention, and then the reporting is how you're doing it. When you think about what's happening with reporting, and Andrew was talking about this, with the analysts, for the longest time, companies would say, we're doing all this great stuff in sustainability, and nobody ever asks us questions when we have the analyst calls and the shareholder meetings. I'm really sorry to hear that. Love you guys, bloody investors, what a bunch of jerks. Let me see your deck. Nothing in the deck. There's nothing in the deck. This quarter, next quarter, first quarter, fourth quarter, last quarter, next year's quarter. It's like, you got to give them something to talk about, fellas. And so that's starting to change. And you're hearing that even in the analyst calls, and they're kind of short-term oriented, but it's now getting into the analyst community, they're recognizing it. So the conversation is changing. And I think what Andrew was saying about who's going to control the narrative, are you going to let social media control the narrative, or are you going to control the narrative? The tools are there. Andrew was talking about tools. SASB shows how the material issues connect to financial value drivers. So it's really incumbent, I think, upon the people doing the presentations, investor relations, CFOs, identify the material issues, have a point of view, explain how they're related to financial performance, revenues, gross margins, less employee turnover, better quality, larger share of customer wallet, whatever it is. It's the company's responsibility to put that story together, as you call it, and shape the narrative. And I think we're still at the very early stage of this, because people, know the narrative around talking about financial information, and they're not integrating, they kind of believe in it sort of, but they haven't learned how to integrate it into a more integrated story. And Bob is right, you got to walk the walk first, but if you're walking the walk and you're not talking about how you're walking the walk, how are people going to know?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And I know from our experience of working with corporates, part of the problem is the siloed nature of businesses, right? So the IR people talk to the investors, the sustainability people do this, the risk people do this, and it's actually that getting people together to come up with that and connect the dots, come up with that holistic story, but more importantly, understand how these things impact one another. And I know that's obviously one of the big theories behind integrated thinking and integrated reporting. And it would just be great, maybe Bob, you're shaking your head, just sharing with the people on the panel how we can use the tools that are out there. Bob Eccles mentioned SASB. We know you're a representative of the value reporting framework. Maybe you could tell us a little bit more about what we're trying to achieve with that merger.
Yeah, well, the merger brought together the SASB and the International Integrated Reporting Council, and I'll call it integrated reporting. Integrated reporting is an overall framework for conveying information, both financial and other information. And some people call it non-financial, but it really has ties to financial performance. And talking, as just Bob Eccles just referenced, how the two relate to each other. What we found early on in our research on what we called value reporting at that time was that a lot of these non-financial things were leading indicators of future financial performance, and getting a hold of that and understanding it and what drives what is very important. But SASB has industry specific metrics, disclosures on, as Bob mentioned, different issues that are likely to be material to a company's financial performance and therefore value over time. And so integrated reporting provides the overall framework for the reporting of financial and non-financial and integrating it. We have a lot of the content on financial information from accounting standards and other disclosure standards. SASB provides a lot of the content on the other information that's specific to different companies and different business models. So the two kind of go hand in hand, kind of overall envelope and content within it. Now another aspect is a very important thing. Well, it's great to report stuff, but if your thinking isn't integrated also, and you're actually driving the performance, your financial performance based on the key things that do drive that over time, you're probably not going to report great outcomes, because more and more research shows that those material issues that are identified are very important to your performance, financial performance over time. And all those tools are available on the Value Reporting Foundation website. Integrated thinking, integrated reporting, SASB standards, and how they all relate. Now, we're also very, very, very supportive of the idea of the IFRS Foundation setting up a global standard setting body in this arena, and then beyond that, taking it forward to implement more integrated reporting framework as well. We think it's time for there to be both consistent global standards and them being mandated. We can talk about the different models we envisage, but I think it's, I guess one message I'd leave with people is it's coming. So you should you're not up to speed now, you should try to get up to speed.
Winter is coming. Okay, good. No, that's really helpful. Now, I wanted to ask Andrew, because I know just just picking up on some of those practical resources, I know that you've been publishing several briefs to help organizations consider sustainability issues and how to integrate them into long-term decision making, and then into internal and external reporting. Could you maybe share some top-level insights from those and any advice from some of the work that you've done? And then I see a couple of questions coming in from the audience, so keep them coming. I'm going to start posing those now if my panel would like to take a look at them.
Yeah, sure. First, can I just echo Bob's thing? One set of global standards if we don't get that, we're not going to get this done. Competing frameworks, competing standards just slow everything down and undermine confidence. So, you know, that objective of one set of standards is absolutely key. You know, the kind of things that we've been looking at really come from frameworks around the finance professionals' work, what the finance professionals doing, be it risk management, scenario analysis, corporate reporting. You know, very much, you know, we are the wheelhouse. We own that. We own that piece. And you know, the kind of things that we would say that we need to be doing is, you know, reporting on its own isn't enough. That's where you get what's classically called greenwashing, or, you know, a company says, oh, we want to do an integrated report, and then, oh, we haven't got any of the data for it. The real thing is, no, you haven't got any of the data. You also haven't done the thinking to get it right anyway. So yeah, it's very much, if you like, setting out your purpose, setting out your values. You know, both of my colleagues have touched on this, and ultimately it comes round to the culture. It comes round to what goes on throughout the business, and that's all about, yeah, it's set by the CEO, but it's also what gets measured, what gets reported on, what does appear, you know, what appears on the front page of that board pack. What are the key measures? Getting that right, making that happen is where it all flows from. So, you know, setting the vision, and then setting your metrics and getting that reported on. It doesn't, you know, people go, oh, do we have to report this thing every month? Well, the answer is no, you don't always. Some stuff doesn't move fast enough, but it's always got to be there so people see it, so it's front of mind. And if you want to see, you know, if you want a great example of it, just compare the stories of Kraft and Unilever in the time since Kraft tried to take over Unilever. And you see the difference in performance from one business which said it's all about long term. The other was in the old world of short-term value creation.
Yeah, really good point. And actually there's a question here, and I think it probably is a common theme. The question is, what is the relationship between value creation and shared value concepts? And I think the language is a challenge in a lot of these issues. We've got the alphabet soup of standard makers, we've got ESG, we've got sustainability, corporate responsibility, all these different terms that people are grasping with. So would somebody like to tackle that? What's the relationship between value creation and shared value concepts? Are they one and the same? Are they different? Who would like to tackle that?
Well, I view them over time as being, should be synonymous, but at points in time it can differ because, you know, market's perception of a particular company's value and things that drive its stock market price, at least on a short-term basis, can you know, have disconnects with the underlying intrinsics of the business and its fundamental performance. But over time, if the markets are, you know, operating well, and as we've said, they need good information, including the kind of stuff we've been talking about on this, to perform, you know, their function well. You know, the value creation on a fundamental basis should be reflected in the share price over time.
Helpful. Bob, did you have?
But I'll leave it to Dr. Bob to further elucidate on that.
Bob, did you have anything to add? I'm sure you do.
Not really. I think Handsome Bob nailed it. You know, I'll invoke my friend Mark Wiseman, who was the CEO of CPPIB, big Canadian pension fund, senior executive at BlackRock. He said value and values converge over time. So Bob nailed it.
Good. Actually, there's a question here, and I think this is a really interesting one. And it's a question from Isabel. So thank you, Isabel. It says, how does this apply for small companies, particularly maybe a company with, she says specifically a media company with no factories, limited impact on the environment, no big budgets? What should they be reporting on? So I think to take it to a broader context, those companies that don't have an obvious impact on the environment, how do you develop a purpose to support that?
Do you want me to take a hit at that one?
Yeah, sure.
I mean, I think this is as relevant to small businesses as it is to big business. This isn't, you know, when we talk about sustainability in the business context, we're talking about the long-term success of the business. We're not, you know, we're not specifically talking about the environment. And I think there's some confusion. There's some confusion that comes in there. And the idea, you know, if it's a small media company, can equally look at its stakeholders in the same way as a large business would. Its impact on the environment might be very, very different. That doesn't stop it from having purpose, and it doesn't stop it from looking at this idea of long-term value creation.
Okay.
And depending on the type of media company and the technology element to it, data privacy issues, you know, veracity of the content that's going to the media site, you know, is it being co-opted by extremist groups? I mean, you know, it's not just about the environment. I mean, there's ESG issues all over the place. And what SASB's done a brilliant job on is to identify those 11 sectors, 77 industries. There isn't a single one of those 77 industries that has zero for material issues according to their framework. So media companies, go look up SASB, the materiality map. It's one of those tools Ansel Bob talked about in the public domain. You get a pretty good sense as to what you should be paying attention to.
Now, just following on from that, Bob, there's a question about, do disclosures need to be quantified in dollar terms to avoid greenwash or whitewash? Purpose being the latest was the comment. And that's a really good one. So if the company hasn't been able to quantify, maybe not even able to measure in some cases, what do you do in the interim? Bob Hertz, you look like you've got a view on that. Maybe you could start.
Yeah, because maybe the next frontier is I'll call it the monetization or monetary quantification of the underlying performance as portrayed by physical and other metrics. But I think first we're trying to get the metrics and disclosures consistent, you know, and as Andrew said, a set of global standards, at least a baseline of global standards, common standards. But there are a number of groups that have been working on, you know, how do you then take those metrics and convert them into monetary amounts. So I can refer you to, there's a project at the Harvard Business School on impact-weighted accounts. There's a group called the Value Balancing Alliance, VBA. There's an effort at NYU, New York University, called Return on Sustainability Index, which is kind of for internal reporting and calculating IR, you know, investment returns and NPVs and things like that. So to me, that's kind of the next frontier. But first we need good underlying metrics. Then we need to also kind of agree on kind of standard ways of converting all of these things to monetary amounts, because it's kind of a two-step process. And right now the focus mainly is on the first stage, but work is being done on the important work's being done on the second step as well.
I think Bob is right on that. I can give you one other example that's interesting. So I mentioned engine number one and that whole ExxonMobil campaign. So I know these guys reasonably well, and they've got a paper, and I don't know if it's in the public domain yet, called the Total Value Framework. They did with a colleague of mine, Dave Larker, who's at Wharton, who's got this ESG analytics lab. And Bob, you must know him in the way you're nodding.
Oh, yeah.
And what they say they've done is they've come up, now it's a proprietary methodology, but they've come up with a way of measuring in dollar terms positive and negative externalities. And this is going to inform their investment process, and they're creating, ETFs. So here now you've got this interesting thing of sort of the activist investors who used to be the bad guys are now, at least in this case, sort of on the leading edge of trying to figure out how to do this monetization, even before we get to standards using lots of data, to look at the impact. And it's not just ESG, internal operations, but impact, positive and negative externalities, and having an investment thesis behind it. That's very interesting.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And just to follow on from that, one of the questions is actually about ESG become an accepted construct, and we've been doing, the E and the G for quite a while, and it's taken decades to kind of get that to grips. The question really focuses on, does the panel think that the S, in the form of human rights, modern slavery, etc., will take as long to get the attention as the other areas? We know it's been accelerated through the pandemic, but is it going to move much more quickly in terms of reaching some sort of standardization?
My sense is that the first area of focus is likely to be on climate, and that's not to say there are already lots of standards that deal with the social issues, whether they be GRI or SASB or other ones. But I think if the IFRS Foundation does set up this global standard setter, probably the first thing they would put out would be probably on climate. But that everybody's telling them that's not the sole focus. That could be the first thing, but there's a lot of other things to do. And I think the other thing people are telling them is, this kind of takes me back a little bit to my days as one of the original members of the International Accounting Standards Board, where we had to have a starting point because there were already people using the old international accounting standards that have been put out by a predecessor body. They've been using them largely on a voluntary basis, but there were lots of reporters, and similarly there are lots of reporters in the ESG space. The SASB has over 1,000 companies now reporting SASB metrics. So it's important to say, okay, here's a starting point. Don't stop and wait for us for 2 years to put out standards. And so, I've been kind of advocating at least have a clear starting point and then clearly set out your agenda.
I think it's a good question. It's tricky, right? For three reasons. I think what you've got with climate is there's a physical thing, carbon emissions. So, as Bob said, there's different metrics, but you can kind of ground it in that. There's science that sort of gives you what targets should be, and standards and targets are different, but the Paris Agreement and so forth. And it all kind of goes up into the atmosphere. And so, unless you're a Republican in the United States, you think climate change is real, you sort of need to deal with it. Human rights is, it's kind of like scope 3 in a way, it's supply chain. So getting supply chain data, scope 3 is hard. It's a little bit harder to quantify. And there's more kind of culturally specific things on what human rights is. And so it's a big controversy, that we have with China, right? In China, you can talk about environmental issues. You've got to be very careful about how you talk about human rights. So I think coming up with global standards and the momentum around human rights, I think it's really important, but I think it's going to be harder.
Going to be harder. Okay, super. I would agree with that. Okay, we've got a couple minutes left. So just to wrap up, what I'd like to do is I'm going to go around to each of our panel, and if you could just offer a key piece of advice in about 30 seconds. Bob Eccles, when you address it, if you wouldn't mind addressing, there was a question about if you were going to create a committee to draft the corporate purpose, who would you be cool to include on that committee? And can you give some examples of companies that have good corporate purposes? So maybe you could wrap that up when you're answering. And there was also a question about what is the future of integrated reporting as well. If somebody wants to wrap that up in their close, that would be great. So should I start with Rob Hertz, because we started the day with you. Why don't we end the closing with you as well?
Yeah, well, I would say, as I said before, this is no longer a nice to do. It's going to be a necessary to do. The reporting standards will, in my view, be mandatory. They may come out of this new global board that the IFRS Foundation, but also the Europeans Union is working on standards. The SEC said they're going to put out more requirements. So, you know, the train's leaving the station. You need to get up to speed and you need to get on board. And we talked about a lot of the different resources that are available. And I think, you know, you'll find it kind of an exciting and I think satisfying area to get involved in. That's my main thing. I'd say it's integrated reporting. I think it's kind of here to stay. We're hoping that if there's a global standard setting body under the IFRS Foundation, since they have both that and the ISB, you know, they will help further develop that.
Super, thanks. So get on that train. It's leaving the station. I like that. And Andrew, what about you? Some final sort of pieces of advice for the attendees.
Yeah, I'm going to be very granular. You know, we've got a lot of finance professionals out there listening to this. I would say to them, you know, get your top level scorecard right, cascade that through the organization, talk about it and be proud of it. And that's going to start to shift your culture.
Nice. I like that. Talk about and be proud of it. That's really great advice. And finally, Bob Eccles.
So let's end this on two shocking notes. So you want a good example of a statement of purpose? It's my client, Philip Morris International. You know about this, Sally. They're a tobacco company. You know, I get that. Long story. It's in their 2019 proxy statement. They're a US listed company. What was the process? Started with the sustainability group. We worked on a draft. It went to senior management. The CEO reviewed it word by word by word many times. The whole board of directors reviewed it. They published it in the public domain, and every board member has put its signature to it. If a tobacco company can put a statement of purpose in a proxy statement, anybody can do it. Second shocking thing, and this will be only really for Bob Herz, and I apologize for taking public time in a webinar and doing this in such a public fashion, but the copyright, the patent, and the trademark expired on value reporting, Bob. You know, no one checked with me when the Value Reporting Foundation had a name. I've retained legal counsel. You will be hearing from my lawyer. I am launching a class action lawsuit against the Value Reporting Foundation to get what's justly mine. And I just want everybody to know about that.
Glad
they didn't ask me either, but I did check this morning, and the great news is that the book is actually still available on Amazon and other leading online booksellers, and it makes a very thoughtful birthday or special occasion present.
Absolutely.
Okay. Could you please write a new one? 20 years. Come on, we've got to have some new thinking to move us forward. And please, can I encourage you all to take away some of the really great practical advice that the panel shared with us today? And let's please get those numbers up for next time we do the survey. I will be so depressed if we don't move the needle on this. There's such an opportunity and momentum in the marketplace. So let's keep talking and keep nudging the debate. So thanks very much to Bob, the Bob and Bob Show, and then Andrew as well. Sorry, it's been a great webinar and glad to have so many of you join us. Look forward to continuing the conversation.
Thank you, Sally. Great job.
Guys.
Take care.
Cheers,
Excellent.
everybody.
Thank you
Bye-bye.
so much, everyone. Thank you so much for our speakers, and thank you to everyone who has joined us today for this webinar. You'll receive an email in a few hours' time, which will include a link to a recording of the webinar. The email will also include a link to the Survey Monkey. It would be grateful if you could take a few moments to give us your feedback online. Thank you very much, and thank you to our speakers. Enjoy the rest of your day.
You might see a little whatever you call it, surge in people buying the book. There were quite a few people asking if it was still available.
I had to, you know, I know that Bob is so impoverished that you got to make it up. So.